everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, The Truth About Learning Styles and Why It Matters for Your Child's Success in School. My name is Robin Kerr. I am the co-chair of the Schools Committee for the UVA Club of Washington, D.C. For any of you that don't know much about the club, we put together all kinds of programming and events for UVA alumni, parents, and friends that live in the greater D.C. area. And actually, the DC area has one of the largest concentrations of the UVA community in the entire world. We have over 100,000 alumni, parents, and friends that live, somewhere in DC, Maryland, or Virginia. So that's cool. And the Schools Committee puts on programming like what you are here for tonight, educational programming for parents of high school students. We also put on events for high school seniors who have been accepted into UVA or have committed to going to UVA. And also parents of current UVA students. But the UVA Club as a whole, we have lots of other committees that put on other types of events. We have a book club. We have a sports committee that does game watches. Our social committee actually is putting on a ℎ𝑎𝑛𝑑𝑠 party that's coming up on December 15th, I believe. That should be really, really fun. So if any other of these events intrigue you, we would love for you to check us out at ℎ𝑑𝑠-𝑜𝑛.org and sign up for our newsletter so you can learn more and see more about what we have going on. And with that, we'll get on to tonight's event. We're going to learn tonight about the most effective study strategies that all learners should master, how to help your student mesh their preferences with other activities to better challenge their brain, and more. And Anne Dolin is your speaker tonight. She has nearly 30 years of experience working with students and is a former public school teacher and author who founded her company Educational Connections in 1998, where her team provides tutoring, executive function coaching, test prep, and college admissions counseling for folks in the DC area and beyond. So with that, I will turn it over to Anne and enjoy the webinar.
Robin, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I asked a question as everybody was coming in. So I'd love to hear what brought you here this evening. If you could type in the question that you would like to have answered, that would be wonderful. That will help to guide our discussion. So as Robin mentioned, tonight we're talking about learning styles and why learning styles, or learning preferences, as we should say, matter for your child's success in school. I started out my career as a teacher with Fairfax County Public Schools. And I remember it was either the first or second year of teaching that I went to a workshop on learning styles. And they told me to give a quiz to my students and to figure out what kind of learner they were, and then to group kids by their learning styles, and then to tailor my instruction so that I was meeting auditory learners or kids that were just visual or kinesthetic learners. And so for a long time, I thought learning styles were a thing. Well, it turns out that more recently, we've realized that learning styles really was more of a trend and actually not based on research. In fact, you can see that some of these quotes, there's no adequate evidence that incorporating learning styles into general ed practice really works by giving kids assessments. And it doesn't work either when teachers modify instruction to teach to different types of learning styles. But learning styles are really catchy and people love to categorize themselves. But the thing is, even though there's no research to support whether you're definitely an auditory learner or you have to learn visually or just kinesthetically, it doesn't really mean that kids don't have learning preferences. So although we know from research the styles part isn't correct, it doesn't mean that you still don't have a preference you lean into. So what are those three preferences? Well, they're visual. Some students will report that they like visuals. They like watching videos or looking at pictures as they read. Or that it's auditory. They like to learn auditorily. Usually this is in the form of a study group where they can hear the opinions of others and hear a discussion. Could be a lecture. And then lastly, kinesthetically, sometimes students will say, well, I like to do it. I like science experiments. I like to work with my hands. Sometimes students will say, well, I really learn it when I do it, when I write it down. That helps me. So I'm curious, before we get into the nitty-gritty, if you think about your child, the one that you're here about tonight, what do you think your child's preference is? Please put that in the chat. Is it visual? Is it auditory? Or is it kinesthetic? Let's see what everybody has. So Anne said her child has an auditory preference. Kinesthetic, says Robert. Visual, kinesthetic, auditory. Awesome. So lots of kinesthetics, and that kind of lines up with what we often see. Kids say, I like to learn by doing. Well, why does all of this matter? Well, as I mentioned, we want to figure out what our kids' preferences are. And I will show you a quiz in a little bit so that you can figure this out with your child. But if the preference is correct, and that is key, I'll talk about that also in just a minute. We want to help kids to lean into that preference, but you can't stop there, because we know that learning just based on your preference one way isn't really conducive to retaining information. You have to layer other strategies on top of that. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, how to use your preference and then layer strategies on top of that to be sure you really, really learn and that you cement that information into long-term memory. So I mentioned that I started out my career in Fairfax County Public Schools as a teacher. On the side, I drove to kids' homes and tutored them. And over time, I realized that that was really my calling in life. And so I ended up leaving my teaching job and starting my company. It's called Educational Connections. That was 25 years ago. And throughout all these years of running the business and working with lots and lots of kids, I've seen that certain things really do make a tremendous difference in how kids learn, retain, and get good grades. And I wanted to mention a couple things that we may not really think about. We kind of think of the big picture things, but maybe not some of these nitty gritty. One is the timing of studying really matters. You know, oftentimes kids will come home from school and they'll just start out with whatever's on top of their mind. Oh, this is a big grade, or this grade counts for a lot. Let me start with math or science. But it turns out that the timing of what you start things is important. I'll preface this with something easy to think about, and that's food. For example, let's say you really don't like broccoli and you love pizza. Well, if you eat the broccoli first, it's not great, but it doesn't taste that bad. You might rate it a 5 out of 10, and then you eat the pizza, which you rate very highly. But if you eat the pizza first, and then the broccoli is actually going to taste terrible. And turns out you're going to rate that much lower, like a 2. The same concept works for studying. So a new study out of University of Pennsylvania found that when kids started with their hardest thing first, they were a lot more productive because they didn't feel it was as difficult. So maybe your child likes English but doesn't like math. Starting with math can really put them on a better path forward to make sure they get all their stuff done in a timely manner. It helps to reduce procrastination as well. Somebody mentioned in the beginning, I said, what do you hope to learn? And I think it was Anne said, my child has ADHD. And we see a lot of that. The other thing that's interesting, and this is more recent research too, is that kids with ADHD have a very high time preference in terms of when they want to work. So often when kids get home from school, we want them to get done with their homework. So we'll say things like, oh, just get started, finish it so you can do other things. But if your child is seriously pushing back, and this has been going on for a long time, it could be that they have a high degree of time preference, that starting at that time is not conducive for them. And starting a little bit later, maybe around dinner time, is going to be better. So if you're getting a lot of pushback about start time, play around with other options. Also, as the years have gone on, I've found that certain study methods are more productive. And there's lots of research around this. How do kids retain information, and how can they study to produce the best results? It turns out kids have this all wrong, like seriously wrong. In one self-reported study, 83% of kids said that they study by rereading their notes. But this is one of the most ineffective ways of going about it. So kids will often take their notes from school, or they'll take their study guide and they'll reread it. They'll read it again and they'll say, I've studied. The problem with rereading is that it creates this illusion of knowing. But kids don't really know. They might know the next day because they put it in short-term memory, but rereading is not helpful for retention of information long-term. So when you have to go to take a unit test, a midterm, or a final, it's not really there because it hasn't been cemented very well into long-term memory. So scientists have found that there are actually two top ways for kids to retain information. And the first one is self-testing. And again, this is really the opposite of what most kids do. They'll take a study guide like this, they'll fill it out, and they'll read it multiple times. But the better way of going about it is to take your study guide, fill it out, make 2 copies of it, and the next day, without looking at the first one, you fill it in the best you can. And then when you can't go further, you can look at the first one and complete it. You do the same thing the next day. Why is this helpful? Because it's not passive, it's active. It's making your brain work hard by pulling out that information. Do I know this? What is it? And anytime you're asking your brain to do that type of thing, you're going to learn it better. So sometimes the teacher will give you a study guide. Sometimes they won't. In my business, we call study skills help that we give kids, we call it executive function coaching. And I'll talk a little bit about executive functions a little bit later. But because kids often don't know how to study very well, and sometimes the teacher doesn't give them a study guide, we teach them how to use their own, create their own. Kids can also use Quizlet as well. But even if they just have their notes, they can cover up the main information in the notes and ask themselves the question, what were the causes of the Civil War? And see if their brain can pull it out, and then they can look at the answer to check if they're right. That is a concept called self-testing. So that's the first way, the best way. Right behind that is another concept called distributed practice. Sometimes distributed practice is also called spaced practice. And basically, it means that, yeah, you could study for an hour on Thursday night. You could cram for that test on Friday. But if you take that hour and you do 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, 20 minutes Thursday, you're actually going to retain more long-term. Why is that? I ask kids this, why is that? And they'll say, well, because you're studying it over and over, because you're repeating it, because you're doing it more. But actually, the answer is because you're sleeping on it. When you learn something and then you sleep on it, your brain is working on it overnight and it's putting it into long-term memory. So we know through lots of studies that it's studying in these short bursts over time that's far, far better for retention later on. All right, so that's some basics in terms of best practices for studying. But let's go back and look at these preferences that we talked about in the beginning. All right, so I mentioned we as parents, I want to encourage kids to lean into what their preference is, especially if they're accurate. So when we work with kids, sometimes we have kids that they're right on, they're spot on, their preference, they know what it is and they're correct. Sometimes it's not always like that. So we're working with them to refine it. But let's say their preference is accurate. You start there and you add some layers. So here's what it looks like. Let's say you have a child who has an auditory preference. So they like listening to a lecture. They can do that actually pretty well. Or they like listening to audiobooks. The added layer, because that's very auditory, is to add some visual and add some kinesthetic. And you can do that just by taking notes. Then you're really going to know it. What does that look like in terms of taking notes? I will tell you, when parents call our office, sometimes they'll say things like, oh, my child's definitely a visual learner. But when they call us looking for help with these study habits, they often say things like, I don't even think my child knows how to study, and he definitely doesn't know how to take notes. Or sometimes he doesn't take any notes. What am I to do? But I wanted to share with you probably one of the most popular note-taking techniques across the country, and it's called Cornell Notes. And I like this a lot. In fact, I was just at a conference last week on ADHD, and there's lots of speakers. And the whole time I took notes in Cornell fashion. It helps me a lot because I put the concept, my notes, and then at the end, I kind of summarize it just in one sentence, and then I can review them. So to see, do I really remember this? And it's helpful. It's especially helpful for kids. So let's say the student, they're in their history class, or maybe their geography class, they're studying Guatemala. They need to know the concept is, the key idea is the 4 neighboring countries. They need to know that. So on the left, they divide their paper a third. On the left is the concepts, 2/3 on the right is the information, 4 neighboring countries, and then on the right, they write that information. And they can use a self-testing method by saying to themselves, what are the 4 neighboring countries? Cover that up, see if they know the answer, and then seeing if it's correct. And again, at the bottom, just summarizing it is super helpful. So that's a strategy for auditory learners. Now, let's say you're a student, also an auditory learner, really learns well in group study sessions. An added layer would be to make it kinesthetic and visual by using flashcards. Flashcards are fabulous. We think maybe they're kind of old-fashioned because we use them, but there's tons of research that shows flashcards are really, really wonderful. So I love it when we work with kids and they're open to making flashcards. All right, now let's move on to visual kids. Let's say they have this idea of reading. Fine, maybe they fall into that camp of 83% that like to reread their notes. It's actually okay if you add layers on top of it. It's just not okay if you only do that. So adding a layer would be auditory. You might say, pause after a section, or pause at the end of the page and say, what's important here? It forces your brain to consolidate the information, summarize it, and then you write maybe a sentence, a couple of phrases about what's important. You can also say, why do I think my teacher thinks I need to know this? Why is this important to me? So putting that in the column is really, really helpful. It's like a feature, basically you're annotating. Highlighters. Sometimes kids get super highlighter happy and they love to highlight as they read. That is not a good idea because you do not know what's important yet. So when you highlight as you read, you highlight everything, and that's not a good thing. It's okay to highlight if you read first, you ask yourself what's important here, you jot something down, maybe you go back and highlight, that's okay, but not as you're reading. All right, so another strategy for visual kids. Maybe the teacher has a slide deck that she's shown in class. You can go back and review that slide deck, but that would be only visual. So in order to add that extra layer, that kinesthetic part, maybe take digital notes in the column. Again, ask yourself, what's important here? How about kinesthetic learners? A lot of kinesthetic kids are okay with paper and pencil. Sometimes they're not great note takers because they'll just jot down a few things and draw a picture, which is actually a really good start. We would work with them on adding some more to that, but taking notes is a really great base layer for kinesthetic kids. And then they can, let's say they take notes, they can print them out, especially if they're taking them digitally, and they can cut up the notes, and they can even put them in 2 piles. They can ask themselves the question, what is this about? So what they know can go on one pile, what they don't know is in another pile, and then they quiz themselves just on the things they don't know. Another way of doing this is with flashcards or Post-it notes, jotting down the information from class and then organizing it into sections. It could be everything I need to know about Guatemala, for example, everything I need to know about another country. So anytime kinesthetic kids can take notes and then do something else with those notes, that's really helpful. A lot of kids like Quizlet. You may have heard of it. Quizlet is fabulous. Ideally, when kids are using Quizlet, they're making their own deck. Oh, and by the way, if you're not familiar with Quizlet, it's a very popular software. Let's say your child's in AP biology and they need to know in the first 2 weeks, there's a quiz on vocab terms. Chances are that somebody's created a deck of cards in Quizlet already. So kids often want to use somebody else's deck because it's easier. That's fine. But if you're going to do that, you need to add layers on top of it. Quizlet has a neat feature where you can add auditory notes, and they have tons of games, and the games are really, really great for kinesthetic learners. So I love Quizlet, especially if you use all the features. Now, if you're interested in knowing where your child falls, what their preference is, you can take a quiz with them, and it's fun. And you can get this if you go to our website, which is ectutoring.com/quiz. And I'll leave that up there for a second so you can write it down. Again, it's ectutoring.com/quiz. And that's a fun thing. You know, no judgment zone. You can do it, have your kids do it, and you can talk about it. And it's fun. Again, it's not a learning style, so we don't want to tell kids this is definitely how you learn. It's just where does your preference fall? All right, so let's talk about some concerns when it comes to studying. As I mentioned, every day parents call our office looking for help for their kids. And sometimes their kids are really high flyers. These are amazing students, are already getting good grades, but the student wants to do even better. So it could be that they need help with a subject. It might be that they want help with some of their study skills. Sometimes kids are really struggling, and it may look like they're doing okay because they have decent grades, but they could be doing a lot better. So one of the issues that we see is that parents often talk about is really just keeping up with assignments. And that means organizing in a couple of ways. And the biggest issue with kids and study habits is organizing time. We often think of organization as just things or, stuff. But actually, the harder part of organization is organizing your time. And so when I think of this concept of prioritizing your assignments, knowing what you have due the next day, knowing what you have due later in the week, and knowing what you have due long term, like in 2 weeks, those are really hard skills for kids. And when we see kids struggling in these areas, it's not because they don't want to do a good job or they're lazy or they're unmotivated. It's typically because they have weak executive function skills. And you may have heard of executive functions before. They're basically these cognitive processes in the frontal lobe of the brain. And they have to do with things like focus and sustaining your attention, knowing when you're off track and being able to self-correct. That's called monitoring and self-regulating. They have to do with managing your emotions and reducing your frustration. So all those things are executive functions, and you can see why they're really important for school success. And if you're interested in knowing more about executive function, we have some stuff on our website about it, which is ectutoring.com/executive-function. But for purposes of studying, I thought today we could focus really on organizing time and prioritizing, because that's usually where kids fall down and when they have the biggest issues. But when kids have difficulties with these executive functioning skills, especially what I just mentioned, sometimes when school is hard for them, they don't put forth a ton of effort because it doesn't feel positive. And when you don't put forth a ton of effort, you often don't get great grades. And when you don't get great grades, it reduces your confidence and the whole cycle starts again. You put forth reduced effort, your grades aren't that great. And so what often looks like a motivation issue or the student is lazy is really a weakness in executive function. And that's really what's causing the issues with motivation. But this is a complicated topic, motivation, but one I think is very, very worthy of a discussion this evening, because it really does tie in to study habits. I think the issue of motivation, especially intrinsic motivation, what makes you tick inside, not somebody dangling a carrot in front of you, is fascinating. And there are actually lots of theories around student motivation, but this is one that I think applies the most to kids, and it's called the self-determination theory. And the self-determination theory basically says, in order for students or individuals to be motivated, they have to have three factors present. And the first one is competence. So they have to feel like this isn't too hard. I can do this. Kind of going back to those executive function skills, if managing your time, keeping up with all these assignments, turning things on time, getting good grades, if that's hard for you, even though you kind of can do it, you may not feel super competent. It happens a lot with math, I would say. And when you fall behind on math, it's really hard to pick yourself up. And so if you don't feel super confident and competent, that will hold you back from true motivation. Sometimes it's an issue with autonomy. Yesterday, I was visiting with a friend of mine, and her son is a senior in high school. And for her son, this actually was the issue with his motivation and autonomy, because when he's in a class where there's friction with the teacher, and he has many of those classes, and the teacher says something like, show all your steps in math, he won't do it because he wants to do it his way. He doesn't really care what she says. Even if she downgrades him, he still will be in refusal mode because he's got an issue with autonomy. It has to be his way. For other kids, especially if they feel micromanaged during homework by a parent, for example, they might feel like they don't have enough autonomy. And then the one I see a lot is relatedness. And is the task meaningful to the student? So going back to math, let's say the student needs to know the Pythagorean theorem. And they might be thinking, like, seriously, this is so dumb. When will I ever use this in life? And the truth is, they might never use this in life. But kids that have purpose will say, you know what? This is kind of dumb. I'm probably never going to use this in life, but might as well learn it because I kind of want to get a good grade at this class. It will help my overall GPA. And then I can go to the college I want. I'm never going to do math again. Maybe they want to go to Savannah School of Art and Design, or they want to study something totally different. They still see that this is part of their journey. So they can find a purpose, even if there isn't a natural one. And so often when kids struggle with motivation, it isn't because they're lazy. It's because one or two or three of these things are at risk. And sometimes kids are resistant to help, especially from a parent. We see this all the time, that parents will say, my child will not work with me, he's so resistant, or I don't even know if she's going to be willing to get help. And it's kind of natural when kids are resistant. And to that end, we want to figure out as educators, where is a student willing to get help? And this is important to know as a parent too, because if your child is really pushing back on you and they don't want help in a particular area, I probably would back off. Maybe there's another area that they are willing to accept help. We have a student self-assessment that we use with our students to ascertain, out of all these executive function skills, and this is for us, this is for a service we have called executive function coaching. We want to figure out where they're willing to allow us in. Because sometimes parents call and they'll say, oh, my child's so disorganized, I really want you to work with on that. Then we start working with the kid and they're like, I don't care about that, I'm not doing that. But they may be motivated to improve their study habits in, say, science, because that grade is important to them. So this breaks down all the executive function skills, and from here we can see whether the child thinks they have a problem or doesn't, and they're not willing to change, or they see it as an issue and they're willing to accept help. So that's key for us to see what our way is in, because we might help with study habits at first, we'll backdoor it to organization, but not at first. So as educators and as parents, our main goal is to have a really good relationship with kids, to earn their trust. And the trust comes from understanding how they're feeling. All right, so part of this has to do with something called the stages of change. Kids come to the table. Sometimes they're, in that mindset of, I don't have a problem and not willing to change. But most kids see that it could be problematic, their study habits, and they may want to change. And then we also see kids that, as I mentioned earlier, they're actually really good students and they want to be even better. They may be studying a certain way and they get decent grades, but for the amount of time they're putting into something, they could be doing a whole lot better. So they're at a higher level in the ladder of behavior change. So when we work with students, we always want to make sure that they're accountable and that things don't fall through the cracks. And so we'll work with them. We do all of this virtually. We have them open up their portal, their homework portal, and have them click on their subjects to see what they have coming up, what's due soon, what's due later on. And then I think this is really, really helpful for kids. I found over the years that kids do better when they have their assignments, and instead of a really long list, they can have a list. That's okay. But they also need to put that list into their calendar. And it's helpful because when you just have a list, you're not sure, okay, when am I going to do this? And about how long is this going to take? And what exactly am I going to do? So we work with kids to look at their after school schedule and to find these pockets of time. We call them weird windows. Might be just these short segments of time that they would have otherwise been, searching through social media, and put those tasks into their calendar so that they have now when I'm going to do it and what I'm going to do. And then complete the hard task first. We always do that with them, and anticipating obstacles. And I think this is another skill that, we can talk to kids. We always talk to kids about as educators, and we can as parents too, if they allow us to have the conversation. Often kids get into trouble because they don't think of what could go wrong. So they have maybe a big history test on Friday, and they've got a lot of stuff going on. They might have a sports banquet on Wednesday night and they have play practice on Thursday, and they have unrealistic expectations about how they're going to study for that. So we'll talk to them about anticipating obstacles. What if, this takes you longer than you thought? Or a more common one is, what if you don't want to get started on this? What if you're really starting to procrastinate? How will you get over that hump? And we always have strategies for students. Using a timer, for example, is super helpful. But getting kids to think, okay, what could go wrong? And even if it's just a discussion, so that they have a couple of strategies in their back pocket. So when it does happen, because it inevitably will happen, they have a strategy. So I hope that's helpful in understanding, ways that you can help kids too in your family. But we're here for you. If we can help you in your family with any of these executive function skills, we're happy to. And this is a QR code you can scan to set up a call to see if we can assist you. But I'd love to go to Q&A and talk about the questions that you have when it comes to learning preferences and study habits. So let's see. what we have. And by the way, if you have a question now, please throw it into the chat. Let's see. Somebody said my son is a visual learner, and he's a 99% visual learner. And language is more of a challenge. So sometimes when kids have a preference for visual learning, anything can really be a challenge. And oftentimes when we see, I think you might mean a foreign language, when we see kids struggling in cumulative subjects. So cumulative subjects are things where one skill builds upon another. This is math, foreign languages, and math-based science like chemistry and physics. When kids have a shaky foundation in the beginning, then all the things that they learn after that are going to really, really be hard for them. So sometimes when kids are struggling with a foreign language, math and math-based science, and we say things like, pay attention, study harder, it doesn't work because they have a fundamental problem with the basic skill level, and they need help with filling that gap in so that they can learn things after. So I'm not sure how much that has to do with the visual learning, but I would say that if your child's struggling with a foreign language, probably getting a tutor or seeing the teacher a couple of times per week after school would be super helpful. Let's see. Will this be recorded? And Robin, I think it's being recorded. I hope it is.
Yes, it's being recorded,
okay.
and we will email it out to everyone in the
great.
next couple weeks. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Somebody said many students have an IEP based on having ADHD or another learning disability. Is there something similar for kids who may have low executive function skills? So if you have an IEP, which is special education designation, or a 504, which is classroom accommodations, there's really not exact executive function accommodations, but some common ones are extra time on tests, preferential seating, the ability to make up work, which is actually very commonplace right now, the ability to maybe hand something in late when needed, although I personally don't love that accommodation, but I do see it on a lot of 504s and IEPs. But really, the best executive function accommodations are that the teacher is that you're able to keep in touch with the teacher. And that's the main thing, because sometimes what we found in working with kids is that the portals aren't up to date. So the student will think that they turned something in and it isn't showing up in the portal. Sometimes the teacher hasn't graded it. Sometimes the student really didn't turn it in, which is common. Sometimes the student did it and they just forgot to submit it. So anytime there's a pathway to the teacher, you don't even need a 504 and IEP, but good communication with the teacher is really key. What is the earliest age a child can take the learning style, the learning preferences quiz? I mean, I don't know, probably, maybe like late elementary school. But I would say that if you have a young child, you'll want to help them in ways that are multimodal. So for example, if your child has a spelling test, it's not in their best interest to read the spelling words. It's going to be better for them if you read the spelling words like a practice test. You give them the word and they write it down. First, that's great because it's in the format of the test. That's how they get the test in class. But also now they're using visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And anytime kids can use that modality, it's great. So when kids are working on a test, maybe they have a social studies test, try to allow them to do it in the format of the test. So if they have the study guide, definitely practice using the study guide. You can call out the questions and have them write it down. That's a little bit better than them just saying it out loud. But honestly, if they're willing to study with you, I would take it any way you can get it. Let's see. I wonder how you are supporting students to be less stressful. It might be frustrating for freshmen and new immigrant students that they're aligned with the education system in college. I'm not sure quite what that means, but I will say it is really hard, not just for kids that are new to the country, but also kids that are just freshmen in general. These transition times test executive functions and study habits more than anything else. And so when kids go into 7th grade, they go into 9th grade, or when they start their junior year, or even from 3rd to 4th grade, when they go from kind of learning information, learning to learn, to now they have to learn for information. Anytime you have a transition, it's going to be more challenging for kids. And that's when, even though kids might say, don't bother me, I have this, you still really want to lean in and have dialogue with them. That's great. I'm so glad. How are you feeling about this? Or, I'm here if you need anything. So not just dismissing it as they don't want to have a conversation with you. There still should be conversations, because we need to keep a pulse on things, not hovering, but making sure that if they do fall down, that, we can get them the support they need when they do need help. All right, Robin, I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, I don't
What are you seeing?
either.
Does anything come to your mind that you're curious about?
Honestly, it's been so long since I've had to really study or been in school. To be honest, I'm just glad I don't have to take notes anymore. Well, I'm going to quickly talk about a program that UVA has, and if anyone does have any last questions, give you a few minutes to get those into the chat. But this is a program that UVA has that a lot of folks are not aware of, so we love to bring attention to it during our events. It's called the College Compass program, and it is created for UVA alumni families to help them when their students are pursuing the college application or transfer process. So they have an expert team of college advisors, and they give you a personal college planning journey, resources, and a unique place to connect with other families that are doing the same thing. I have to put the disclaimer in there that it does not help your student get into UVA, but it's to help with the college process in general. So I'm going to drop a link to this in the chat. Again, it is called the College Compass program, and it's wonderful. Definitely check it out. And if you have any questions about the program, contact information for the folks at UVA will be on their web pages. Yeah, I think I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I think we can probably wrap it up. Like I said, we will email everyone the recording in a couple weeks. It usually takes the Office of Engagement a week or two to get this up on the YouTube page. But once we have it available, we will email it out. And maybe you want to drop your contact information or a link in the chat, just so everyone has it. And Anne will actually be doing another event with us on January 30th. If this was helpful for you and you want to come back and hear her talk about a slightly different topic, that event, let me pull it up, is January 30th at 7 p.m. And that is going to be called the Roadmap to College, Strategies to Help Students in Each Year of High School Rise Above the Competition. And like I said, if you're signed up for our email newsletter, we will be sending out a registration link for that when it's available. And it is not available yet. It will hopefully will be by the time we email out this recording. So then we can include the registration link to the next event with the recording email with the recording from this one. So with that, I think that's all I have. Anne, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Thank you all for coming, and I wish you a very happy holiday season.
Yep. Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.